This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Richard Hayden of New York's Highline to explore how the space has grown and transformed, its evolving plantings, newly added areas, and the thoughtful maintenance practices that have helped it become a beloved essential part of daily life for both residents and visitors. We trace how this once industrial rail line has matured into one of the city's most treasured green spaces.
My name is Richard Hayden, and I'm the Senior Director of Horticulture here at Friends of the Highline, which is the conservancy that takes care of the Highline Gardens, which is a New York City park. I've been here 3.5 years. I actually moved back to New York from Los Angeles to take this job. I did all my horticulture on the West Coast. So it was a great opportunity to learn kind of a brand new box of crayons, a box of plant styles that I didn't know that well. And then, of course, get to work in what I think is the most important public garden of the 21st century.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about visiting the garden yesterday, and I have been before, it struck me that you took what was potentially and maybe an unpromising site and made it something that is absolutely, as far as I can tell, integral to the lives of the people who live in the city and to the tourists who visit as well. It's such an attraction. And I'd be really interested to know how it's kind of embedded itself into the community since it was conceived.
So for those folks that don't know, the Highline is a 1.5 mile long New York City park that is built on a former elevated rail track that was built in 1934 to bring freight into the west side of the manufacturing side of Manhattan. And the train stopped running in 1980. And nature abhors a vacuum, as we all know. Anytime we garden, anytime there's an open spot, things will seed in. And the Highline became a self-seeded garden. And about 20 years after the train stopped running, there was a big movement to see what the Highline would be. And they were tearing down a good portion of it at that point. And our two founders met and decided that they would advocate for turning it into a park and a garden. And they did that. Really through a series of synchronous, wonderful opportunities to engage the public and show them what it could be. And so they hired some designers in about 2004 to work on the park. One of those was Piet Oudolf, who's at the time was a Dutch nurseryman and garden designer. And Piet worked with James Corner Field Operations to create what the Highline is. And of course, it's taken on a life of its own now because it's become very popular. And I like to say everybody loves a redemption story, and the Highline is the ultimate redemption story because it was a hulking mass of iron infrastructure that has been turned into a biodiverse, important spot for people to relax, enjoy nature, to commute. And of course, it's, I think, the second most visited attraction in all of New York.
Wow, that is quite an achievement given all the things you've got here. I mean, I came in 2016, and what struck me, I think, since then is it appears to have spawned a lot of people in the area around it to garden. I see like lots of planting now popping up, and that's almost become an extension of the Highline in itself. Is that something that's kind of that you've witnessed happening?
Well, it's interesting. So the Highline was originally funded by some of the municipal funding to kind of revitalize this part of Manhattan, which was a lot of warehouses. And part of that revitalization has really gotten juiced with some significant housing and some condominium buildings and such. And they often have roofs and balconies and things like that along the Highline that get inspired. And I think the Highline just as a project, the idea that you could have a biodiverse, naturalistic garden that really is beautiful in all 4 seasons was the thing that we introduced to the idea of urban landscapes. And I think being a champion of that has really increased the way we think about public gardens and the way people are looking at urban landscapes.
So touching on the biodiversity angle, I noticed you have signage up that says we are a biodiverse space, and you mentioned it just before when we were chatting. Were there benchmark audits done on the levels of biodiversity in the garden, and is that something you monitor going forward, and have you seen an improvement or an increase?
That's really a good question. So The gardens were not designed as a habitat garden, but I think one of the offsprings of naturalistic gardens and of Pete's designs is that because there are so many different kinds of flowers, we're 160 species of plants and trees that are native to New York City are part of the mix. And they weren't chosen because they're native to New York City. They were chosen because they're just great plants. So you combine that with the fact that we leave the grasses and all of the perennial seeds up all winter. We're feeding the birds in the winter. We're providing hiding places. We have nesting spots for bees, et cetera. So we did a survey in 2017, before my time, but with the American Museum of Natural History. Their entomologist, Sarah Kornbluth, came and did a survey. And they identified 33 species of bees using the Highline for food and shelter and food. And 27 of those were native. And some were kind of rare and unusual. And based on those rather unique bees, we've adopted the way we do our cutback to leave certain stems longer because we know these certain bees need a certain pithy kind of stem. And so there's certain plants that have been identified. So that was 2017. We're back this year. We worked with the Bee Conservancy to do some surveys. We actually have a project coming up with the New York City Bird Alliance. Next week, we're doing some bird walks, and we're part of what's called the Biodiversity District Project, where they're taking an entire section of Manhattan, and everyone who has green space is coming together to talk about the ways that we can promote biodiversity. And then I'm really excited to share that we just, I think on Monday of this week, got results back from a bat survey that we did on the Highline. And it was a very kind of short survey. You put up a microphone that's able to record the ultrasound echolations, if you will, of the bats, and they can identify the species, and they know how many times a bat. And it's migration season, so they're going south, and we had, I think even on one night, we had 74 bats that were identified, one of which is the hoary bat, which is a rather unusual. And so the bat scientist was really amazed that there was that much activity. So it's really fun to see that kind of support can happen in a park that's just 1.5 miles long and 50 feet wide. And we do a horticulture celebration every year. This is, I think, what you were referring to. It's called Nature in the City this year. And we're leaning into that urban ecology story and talking about all the benefits, all the animals that are visiting. And then, we like to think that biodiversity is the support of species. And one of those species that we support are human beings who need access to nature. Right? Just getting up above the street, watching the birds and the bees and getting the biome of the forest to breathe up. It's a really important aspect of what we do.
Yeah. You have sort of areas of greenery, and obviously over the other side of the river, you've got a lot of forest, I presume, from looking at it. So I guess you're kind of expanding the territory for things and providing, as you say, actually inadvertently, because it wasn't designed for that, but you're just expanding that territory and providing resources for things to kind of move closer into the city.
Well, some of your listeners may be familiar with a researcher from the U.S. called Doug Tallamy, who's written a book called Bringing Nature Home. And in his second book, Nature's Best Hope, he does a section on the Highline where he came for a visit, was surprised to see this leafcutter bee, walked a little further, saw the tree, the redbud tree, where there were the little cutouts of the leafcutter bee chewing up the little sections of the leaf to make its nests. And he was just flabbergasted that here in the middle of New York City, there could be a spot. And he called us an important connector between wild places. And I think that's a really good way to think about how we all want to garden. We all want to be that spot where biodiversity and butterflies and bees and all of the animals that are losing their native habitats, we can recreate that in our own yards and urban parks.
Yeah. Yes, Doug's been on the podcast, actually.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
Yeah. He's one of my real heroes, so that's good. Really good to know. So you talked about the maintenance practices evolving because of wildlife. Have they evolved in other ways? I guess lessons have been learned since you first opened, and that's moulded how you manage the site. How has that kind of evolved in maybe the last 5 years?
Another good question. So we were so lucky to do an article for the New York Times last year talking about kind of the techniques that we use to care for naturalistic gardens. I think so many people are embracing this style of gardening, and they're getting a year or two in, and it's a very dynamic landscape. You I like to say if you want to be a successful plant on the High Line, you have to have a certain amount of opportunistic availability. You're aggressively moving into that open spot. You've got seeds or, roots that want to take off. And that's a good way for us to kind of keep the gardens looking lush because it's, you've been out there, it's 30 feet in the air. It's 18 inches of soil primarily. When it's hot, we're a bridge, so it's hot above and hot below the soil and cold above and cold below. So, it's a challenging environment. And with the amount of building that's gone on, we have wind tunnels that form, so we have a lot of wind that we're dealing with. And then one aspect that folks don't often think about is that a lot of these buildings next to the High Line are glass, and there are certain times of the year where we'll get a reflection that will scorch plants. So I like to say if you can survive all of that, it's a really good indication of the kind of plants that we might want to be thinking about planting in the face of a changing climate and climate chaos.
Yeah, definitely. And I noticed as I was walking along as well that there's areas of restoration. And one of the things I was wondering is, are you recreating the original planting plans when you restore areas, or are you adapting the planting so that it's, again, evolving with the climate and everything else?
Right. So yes, there are sections of the High Line right now that are undergoing a renovation. Often what happens is a building will get built next to the High Line, and in the case it's one High Line that went up at 17th Street, and the building went bankrupt. And so it took 9 years for that construction to finish. And so when that happens, they build a protection shed over the walkway to keep people safe so nothing falls on them. But at the same time, we can't really garden in those beds because of the danger from the construction. So 9 years of these beds just not getting any care at all. And fortunately, the construction finished, and this happened last spring, and I was very lucky to have Pete Outdolf. We have him come about every 2 years to give us some advice, and we're never going back to what he thinks is a fix-it of a set-it-and-forget-it landscape plan. He understands that because the gardens are so naturalistic that they're very dynamic. How do you take advantage of things that want to shift and move and still edit? A lot of what we do is editing. We're taking things out. We replant about 6,000 new plants every year. But in the garden renovation areas, I convinced Pete, I said, look at this, would you do something different? And so he did a new plan for us. And so we're excited that theoretically any moment, like it was supposed to happen on Monday and the shovel didn't go in the ground, but hopefully in the next week we'll be starting the construction. And what that will involve will be removing all of the soil. It's been 15 years since the soil was put in. There's a tremendous amount of weed seed back there now. So we've requested that all the soil get removed. Fresh soil will come in. We have a brand new planting plan from Pete, so we'll feel he's constantly evolving the plants he likes to use, which is really interesting to watch. He's got new things that are really successful. So it will feel like a new section of the High Line, and that will go in and probably be finished up next spring. But it is an evolution. Like he will suggest new plants to try based on what he's seeing. Not every plant is successful. He's very fond of heleniums, which are called sneeze weeds, I think is the common name. He always suggests we should put some in, and they just won't grow for us. And it's funny because the Lurie Garden in Chicago, which is also a Pete design, I was there a couple of months ago, and they were saying, yeah, no, we can't get the heleniums to grow either. So it's just interesting the way that, it's like anybody at home. Like you're trying to figure out what's going to work. Some things will, some things will. You keep trying. But for us, it's managing a careful combination of the way things kind of work, the plants repeat in rhythm, how they work. You want to be able to see through certain things to see other things. And as naturalistic as the gardens may seem to folks, they are carefully curated by a staff of 11 full-time horticulturalists.
And also, obviously you mentioned you've got the pressures of construction and surrounding buildings, wind tunnels, which are quite noticeable actually today and yesterday walking through, and all these sorts of pressures to come to bear on the space. How forgiving are the public if there's something, or if you change maintenance practices maybe to be slightly more naturalistic? Does anybody come along and say, oh, well, that looks a bit more messy at this time of year than it did a couple of years ago? Do you deal with that?
We get a lot of what I call horticultural tourists. In fact, you really know that when Pete was here last October, we spent almost 3 days on the High Line, and he's so great. He stops and meets with each horticulturalist, and he hears their challenges and he tells them what he's seeing. And often while we're doing that work on the High Line, he will get stopped and recognized. People would be like, "Oh, you're Pete." And he's so kind. And he stops and chats with them. And then invariably he would say, "Would you like a picture?" And I step back and become the photographer. So there is quite a bit of interest, I think, in the gardens. And for the most part, we get nothing but compliments. I think people are shocked to know how much work we actually do sometimes in kind of maintaining things because, ultimately the desire is to look like we weren't there at all, and that's, I think, one of the tricks that we kind of pull off because it's complex. We have right in the section out in front of where we're sitting here at our headquarters is the Gansevoort woodland, the birch woodland. And you have 25-foot tall birch, gray birches, and then you have flowering shrubs under those like dogwoods and juneberries. And then under that you have rich tapestry of ground covers. And maintaining all of that is really kind of the trick, the magic that we do.
Yeah, especially if, as you say, they're quite tough plants and have a tendency maybe to get outside of where you would like them to be. So yeah, that's a lot of work, isn't it? So thinking about the sort of newer parts of the High Line, what are the newest areas that have been added?
Right. So we've added a section up, which we call the Moynihan Connector, which is brand new construction, and it connects from 30th Street and 10th Avenue over to eventually get you to the Moynihan Train Hall, which is Pennsylvania Station, which is kind of a nice, you can walk, you can take a train into the train station from, usually I think those come in from Pennsylvania, and you can actually walk all the way down to the High Line without ever being at street level, which is kind of nice. And that's based on a New England woodland kind of, and because there's 4 feet of soil in that section, brand new construction, we have red maples, and in fact, it's really looking kind of nice and fall over there. We have the new section at 17th Street that'll go in, which is very exciting, a new peat design, and then we're most excited about a new garden that Pete has designed for us at 34th Street. So the very north end of the park, from 11th Avenue and 30th Street, over to the West Side Highway, gets very close to the Hudson River, and then it scoots up to 34th Street. And that section is what we call the self-seeded landscape, because we've just put a walkway down through what was the original plants, the original self-seeds, which is a really nice way of juxtaposing the designed landscape. But at that very, very north end, a lot of people find that, I think it's marked on the map as the start of the High Line, for instance. People come in there and they expect to see the High Line, and what's up there is some self-seeded things and kind of a mess. So we convinced Pete, since we're doing a new walkway in that section, to do a new garden for us there. And that'll go in, I think, starting next spring. And it's very kind of a lush thicket of a wide variety of flowering shrubs and some trees. And because there's a bus stop there, because there's a parking lot on one side, he's done this garden that'll feel very immersive, and also really great flowering shrubs, which will turn into great summer and fall berries. So I think it will also be a rich bird thicket as well.
Wow. Yeah, again, I've been up that end, and just to think about planting in some of those incredibly narrow strips that performs year round, that looks good to the public, that serves a purpose for wildlife, that, it's just such a tough brief. And the fact that he's kind of pulled it off is a constant source of amazement for me. I mean, it's just such a design feat, isn't it?
Yeah. It's so interesting. He was just here. He's been doing a bunch of projects in the U.S. He did a new, it's called the Calder Gardens in Philadelphia, and he's working on a new garden in Omaha, Nebraska, which is the middle of the country. And because of that, he's always comes through New York on his way back to Amsterdam. So he had his 3rd visit with us this year on Friday. He just popped in, and we were walking the garden, and he said something that was so interesting to me, which is, he said, gardening is not weeding, gardening is looking. It's being able to cast an eye and see the way things are combining and the way things are moving together, and who's dominant and who's not, and how the textures are working, and just this idea that you really need to sharpen your eye to kind of take care of these dynamic landscapes. That's the first thing you need to do. It's more than just kind of a skill.
So thinking about the sort of legacy of the garden now, which I think is fair to reflect on, given that it's been here as long as it has. Certainly, I think, as I was saying, maybe private spaces around it have popped up with planting. And I think perhaps even more sort of public gardens have perhaps come about as a result of the success of the High Line in New York and beyond, and probably globally. I mean, how is the legacy of the site viewed by the people who kind of maybe instigated it and who work on it now?
Well, we were recently chosen by the New York Times in an article they did called The 25 Must-See Gardens in the World. You wouldn't be surprised to know that England had many of those. Sissinghurst, Great Dixter. But the High Line was one of only 2 that were chosen for the U.S. And we were, incredibly honored to be chosen. And it's a subjective list, obviously. But I think it kind of speaks to kind of what the High Line has not only become, but also introduced, right? This idea of the 4-season garden, that brown is a color too, right? That, as Pete likes to say, he likes people to see the beauty in decay. And I think just changing the whole mindset around, I love, don't get me wrong, I love hydrangeas and roses and a clipped box hedge, but it's a little static. And to bring such life in all 4 seasons, I think, is really the thing that we get to be most proud of introducing. And with that comes the things that Doug Tallamy is so proud of, is this idea that wildlife has a place. And all of that life kind of reflects in the way that we experience them as well. And so to see that kind of multiply, but I do think there is this idea that you can just sprinkle out some meadow seeds and you're good to go. It's always so much more complicated than that, and having the strategies to kind of manage that. And also the resources. We're lucky at the High Line. We raise almost $20 million annually with Friends of the High Line to support the work and keep the park open, and the horticulture and our art program and our infrastructure reuse programs. We keep, and education and all of that. It's just it's one big happy family over here.
Well, actually, that was going to be my next question was, how kind of secure is the future of it? Because for everybody that we're facing financial pressures at the moment, and especially with the sort of structure, I don't know what the structure is actually of the organisation. Is it what I would refer to as a kind of charitable trust?
Yes, we're a conservancy, we like to say. A 403B, I think, is the U.S. designation. And that means that the park is owned by New York City. It's a New York City park. But the use agreement was that we would not add to the park budget. So we fundraise annually the entire budget for the operations, which is just under $20 million. And we have a little bit of an endowment, but it's interesting. We're free to the public, open 365 days a year. Like, how many gardens can actually say that, right? And also this idea that we have a really robust member association that supports us, and they do it out of the hope that they can be associated with a organization that is providing free access to nature and education and a park experience. So it is a collective experience, I think. You get people excited around that mission, and you've been out walking in the park, just how interesting it is to have this linear journey through the different biological, ecological habitats of the woodlands and the wetlands and the grasslands. And it just kind of feeds your soul.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of school groups actually out there as well enjoying it. So that's great. So going forward with it, just maybe taking slightly a step back, but it struck me how it is a fantastic construction. The features of it are amazing. And they still, even though I've seen it before, they still kind of, make me go, wow, this is so cleverly designed. And it must get a lot of wear and tear, and it looks like it's holding up fairly well. But is that due to all the work that's going on behind the scenes?
Yes, it was an incredible design, and that was Diller Scofidio and Renfro Architects and James Cornerfield Operations that came up with the kind of the linear nature of the way even the pathway planks are formed and rise up into benches, and the fact that they rescued all of the rails, numbered them, and then put them back in after we renovated the gardens and took care of the lead paint and things. And it's high design, like the lighting, all of the lighting in the park is primarily waist level or below, so that the emphasis is on the plants and then on the incredible skyline experience that you get at night, walking through Manhattan. And we're often compared to being a skyscraper on its side, because running underneath all of that, we have an incredibly complex irrigation system because with only 18 inches of soil, you don't have a lot of cushion. We had a drought the last 6 weeks that's really been making that irrigation even that much more important. But there are a series of pumps that have to bring the water up at 5 different locations along the park. There's cameras, there's security, there's just all sorts of infrastructure that's running, in addition to, I think at this point, 4 outdoor elevators, which are always cranky. We work really hard to make the park accessible, and so it's just amazing how much it takes from facilities. And we have a full-time department that does nothing but planning, design, and construction, looking at revamping and keeping everything up to first rate.
I mean, you can tell just when you see the footfall on it how much it must undergo in terms of wear and tear. So
6.2 million people last year, and in 2019, I think it was 8.5 million. So we're happy that we're so successful. 6.5 is a great number, but it does take its toll after a bit.
So my final question is, and I'm going to put you on the spot now because you don't know I'm going to ask you this, but if you had to pick one time of the year to visit, when would you pick?
Honestly, right now. And I'll tell you why. It's funny, I just was telling this. We have docents who lead tours, and I was walking the park in the morning as I do and working with my team. And I ran into this docent, and she was saying, oh, let me show you a picture from the garden in its prime. And I said, right now, Barbara, is the prime. Because we're at a mix of late season flowers. I mean, here we are almost November 1st, but we still have many asters blooming. There's a few goldenrods. There's a few things still in bloom. But all of the grasses are mature, the seed heads are mature, the fall color is coming really strongly right now. Many of the perennials actually have fall color. And so you get to see the best of both worlds. You're experiencing the garden at its fullest. You're seeing, I think, a really underappreciated aspect of gardens is the movement the plants have. And we get so much of that. And Pete's done such a great job choosing plants that move so well. I mean, every season is great. I would say March is a little quiet. We do our cutback in March, so everything's just kind of gotten coppiced. And we have a lot of spring bulbs that we're spending a lot of time replenishing this year. After 15 years, they've gotten tired. So we're, try planting 3,000 bulbs in a very mature grassland. It's a tricky thing. But honestly, I think right now it's just incredibly spectacular. The sassafras are in full blaze fall color, and it's a beautiful walk right now.
A big thank you to Richard and everyone at the High Line for welcoming me, and for the excellent interview, and to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 323, Wildflowers, Community and Urban Nature, and episode 59, Public Green Spaces with Neil Sinden. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.